Richard Ramirez was a serial killer who operated in the United States during the 1980s. He terrorized residents of California like a demon roaming in the darkness. He was known as the Night Stalker because he would creep into homes at night and stand in bedroom doorways, watching his victims as they slept. He targeted both men and women, raping and killing his female victims in a brutal manner. Even if his victims were strong and healthy, he killed them in their sleep without them being able to defend themselves. His murder methods were pretty shocking. For instance, he'd shoot his victims, beat them to death with an iron bar, cut their throats with a dagger, strangle them, or even kill them with his bare hands. It's this variety and randomness that makes it tough for the police to identify him as a serial killer in the early stages. He was also known as the Devil's Disciple because at every crime scene, police investigators found inverted pentagrams symbolizing satanic worship on his victims, on the walls, and on mirrors. Even after his arrest, he arrogantly shouted, "Hail Satan," in the middle of a solemn court hearing. Richard was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, as the youngest of 5 kids in his family. It was a miracle because his mom worked on the production line at Tony Lama Boots, which was filled with dangerous chemicals. She was exposed to a lot of these fumes over time, which made it unlikely that she would get pregnant. If she did, the baby would probably have birth defects. But Richard was born healthy, even though his 4 older siblings had different kinds of birth defects. Richard's father worked as a police officer in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and after immigrating to the U.S., he took a job with the Santa Fe Railroad. Behind the scenes of this seemingly peaceful life, however, he was addicted to alcohol, had violent mood swings, and often abused his wife and children for no apparent reason. For Richard and his siblings, childhood memories of the warmth and security of home were absent, replaced by fear and pain. And almost every day, they were subjected to beatings and vicious verbal assaults by their father. Richard had the bad luck of suffering 2 pretty serious head injuries when he was a kid. The first accident happened when he was 2 years old. He was curious and climbed on a dresser to get to a radio on top of it. But the dresser lost its balance and hit him hard on the head, causing a severe laceration to his forehead. The second accident happened when he was 5. He was playing next to a swing at a playground, but he didn't notice the swing moving fast. Then he got hit hard on the head and fell into a coma. The accident had a worse effect on him than the first one. He started having seizures and was diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy. During his elementary school years, Richard's family situation led him to gradually close off his inner world. His classmates said in an interview that Richard started out acting normally. He studied hard in school and was a model student. When he was 9 years old, he started to act differently, and he began to isolate himself and interact less with his classmates. However, it was his violent father who was behind this change. Richard was at risk of facing his father's abuse every day when he came home from school, and this unpredictable violence made Richard live in fear. So, to get away from his dad's beatings, 10-year-old Richard even started sleeping in a nearby cemetery because it let him hide from his father for a while. Around this time, Richard started getting to know his cousin Mike, who ended up having a big impact on his life. Mike is a recently returned Vietnam War veteran and a former member of the U.S. Army Special Forces. When he got back from the war, he brought 4 badges of honor and a whole roll of Polaroid photos of the rape, torture, and mutilation of Vietnamese women he'd done on the battlefield. Mike would often show Richard these photos, bragging about his crimes and teaching him how to kill and fight. Because of this, Richard's mental defenses started to break down. Mike even forced him to smoke marijuana, which made him think he was free of worry and pain as he experienced the hallucinations brought about by the drug. When Richard was 13, a shooting linked to his cousin Mike made him even more numb to violence and death. Mike had a family of his own before he went off to the Vietnam War, but when he came back, he started bragging about his war experiences, smoking marijuana, and drinking heavily. His wife is shocked by the changes in him, and they start to argue more and more. During their last heated argument, Mike shot his wife with a .38 caliber revolver in front of Richard. Then Mike was granted clemency at his trial, said because he had PTSD from the war. So he was spared the death penalty and sent to the Texas State Mental Hospital instead. Richard had gotten used to Mike talking about his violent tendencies, but seeing someone die right in front of him made him break down mentally. He became depressed and started to isolate himself from his family and friends. He eventually moved in with his sister Ruth and her husband Roberto. Roberto was a night owl and often invited Richard to go exploring with him late at night. While exploring, Richard would climb into strangers' houses and look out the windows to see who was inside. Richard started using LSD regularly when he was 14 years old. LSD is a strong hallucinogenic drug. At the same time, he also became exposed to the realm of the occult and Satanism. 2 years later, with the onset of puberty, Richard dropped out of Jefferson High School in the 9th grade. By this time, he had begun experimenting with blending his growing sexual fantasies with bloody violence, including but not limited to such extreme behaviors as forced bondage, murder, dismemberment, and rape. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence is that Richard got a job at a Holiday Inn in El Paso, Texas. It was common knowledge that the hotel employees had master keys that could open almost any room. Richard took advantage of this by going into guest rooms at night and stealing from those who were asleep. And someone said that Richard molested 2 kids in a hotel elevator, but he wasn't charged because there wasn't enough evidence or because the victims' families didn't press charges. Another time, Richard tried to rape a woman in a guest room. He was caught and beaten by the victim's husband. This led to him being fired from the hotel. However, the criminal charges against Richard were dropped because the victim's couple, who were only traveling, refused to return to Texas to testify. By the end of 1977, Mike was discharged from the Texas State Mental Hospital and back in Richard's life. By then, Richard had become quite the skilled thief and voyeur. They often exchanged crime tips with each other. Under Mike's influence, Richard learned more survival techniques and also learned how to toughen up. Richard's life at 18 revolved around his older brother, Ruben. Unlike Richard, Ruben served in the military and had a relatively normal life. At that time, Richard moved to Los Angeles, California to live with Ruben. However, instead of his life becoming more stable because of Ruben's influence, it became more chaotic. Because of Richard's growing addiction, he began stealing to raise money to buy cocaine and was looking for opportunities to carry out his murderous plans. During this time, Richard also became further addicted to Satan worship and incorporated this evil belief into his criminal behavior. In the future, psychiatrist Michael Stone looks at Richard's case in more detail and decides that Richard's personality disorder isn't caused by genes or innate factors. It's the result of being shaped by his environment and his own experiences. This disorder makes Richard apathetic towards the pain and suffering of others, and he can't empathize with the fear and pain of his victims. Richard's brutal murder campaign got underway in 1984. The first of his murders for which he wasn't charged right away is said to have happened on April 10, 1984. That's when 9-year-old Mei Lung, a Chinese-American girl, was killed in the basement of an apartment building in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. On that day, Lung and her 8-year-old brother were looking for a missing $1 bill near the apartment building when the murderer approached the little girl and lured her to follow him to the basement. Inside the basement, the killer beat, strangled, and raped Lung, eventually ending her life with a spring-loaded knife and hanging her half-naked body from a pipe. Despite killing at least a dozen people between 1984 and 1985 and living in a hotel in the area where the basement was located, the police did not name Richard as a suspect at the time. The San Francisco police were still trying to solve the case 25 years later in 2009. However, a determined female inspector decided to match the killer's DNA with Richard's and eventually succeeded in identifying Richard as the murderer in the case. However, the case took a new turn in 2016 when the police revealed that there might be another suspect. They had found another DNA sample at the scene and determined that this person was likely present at the time of Lung's murder. This suggests that 2 people probably committed the crime together at the time, but the police didn't share any other details about the second suspect. On June 28th, Jenny Vinco, 79, was found dead in her apartment in Los Angeles Grasser Park. The autopsy report showed that she had been stabbed several times in the head, neck, and chest, and her throat had been cut and she had been almost completely decapitated. If put all the facts together, it seems that Richard picked on Jenny because he wanted to steal money to buy drugs. That night, he took the mesh screen off his window and went into her room through there. He saw Jenny was asleep and killed her right away with a knife, then took all her stuff. 9 months later, new murders happened. On March 17, 1985, Richard attacked 22-year-old Maria Hernandez in the garage of her Rosemead home. He shot Maria in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. The bullet bounced off a key in Maria's hand, and she survived after pretending to be shot. Maria's roommate, 34-year-old Dale Yoshi Okazaki, was in the house when she heard the gunshots and rushed to hide behind the kitchen counter. When she heard footsteps, she looked up to see who it was, but Richard shot her directly in the forehead, killing her instantly. An hour later, Richard went to Monterey Park, where he saw a car pulling up. He went to the car and pulled Tsai Lan Yu, a 30-year-old from Taiwan, China, out of it and shot her twice with a .22 caliber handgun before immediately fleeing, and this victim was taken to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead. The three cases got a lot of attention in the news, with Richard being called the walk-in killer and the Valley Intruder. Survivors said he had curly hair, bulging eyes, and decaying teeth. Just a week later, Richard was back at it with another killing spree. This time, he went back to the house in Whittier that he'd burgled a year earlier. At around 2 a.m., Richard quietly entered the house and brutally murdered 64-year-old Vincent Charles Zatsara. Vincent's wife, Maxine Lavinia Zatsara, 44, was woken up by the sound of gunshots. She was then beaten and had her hands tied up by Richard while he cornered her about the location of valuables in the home. While Richard was stealing, Maxine managed to escape her bonds by pulling out a shotgun from under her bed, not realizing that it was unloaded. When she tries to shoot Richard, the gun doesn't fire. Then Richard shoots her 3 times with the pistol, ending her life. Then, Richard grabbed a big carving knife from the kitchen and carved an inverted cross into Maxine's chest, mutilated her body, and removed her eyes, placing them in a jewelry box. At the scene of the crime, the police found footprints in Avia's sneakers. They also found bullets that matched those used in the previous attack. This evidence convinced the police that they were dealing with a serial killer. On May 14th, Richard broke into the home of 66-year-old Bill Doy and his disabled 56-year-old wife, Lillian. At the time, Bill was trying to get his own handgun for self-defense, but he passed out after being shot in the face with a .22 semi-automatic pistol by Richard. Richard then entered Lillian's bedroom, bound her with thumb cuffs, and raped her after stealing their valuables. At the time, Bill survived and managed to call the police at the time, but he eventually died of his injuries in the hospital. Lillian received medical treatment and was able to provide the police with a description of her attacker's appearance, and she survived until October 18, 1991. On May 29th, Richard kept up his campaign of terror. This time, he drove to Monrovia in a stolen car and stopped outside the home of 83-year-old Mabel Bell and her 81-year-old disabled sister, Florence Lang. After breaking into their home, he found a hammer in the kitchen and used it as the murder weapon. He then attacked and bound Lang with the hammer in her bedroom and proceeded to do the same to Mabel. He also electrocuted both women with an electrical cord, causing serious injuries. After committing these atrocities, Richard raped Lang and used Mabel's lipstick to draw satanic pentagram symbols on her thighs and on the walls of both bedrooms. Both women were found alive but in a coma with serious injuries 2 days later. In the end, Mabel died of her injuries in the hospital on July 15th, and Lang died in August. Richard also broke into the home of 42-year-old Carol Kyle the next day. He held Kyle and her 11-year-old son at gunpoint, tied them up in handcuffs, and ransacked the house. On the night of July 2nd, Richard snuck into Arcadia in a stolen car and picked the home of 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon at random. He managed to get inside without being noticed and found her asleep in her bedroom. He then used a lamp to knock her out and took a 10-inch butcher knife from the kitchen before stabbing her to death. Just 3 days later, Richard struck again. This time, he broke into a home in the Sierra Madre Mountains and attacked 16-year-old Whitney Bennett. Whitney was asleep in her bedroom at the time, and then he hit her in the head with a tire iron. Since he couldn't find a knife, he tried to strangle Whitney with a telephone cord. According to Richard's later confession, he was surprised that Whitney actually started breathing again, even though the cord gave off an electric spark. Then he left the scene because he thought that Jesus Christ had saved her. On July 7th, Richard broke into the Monterey Park home of 60-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson. When he found Nelson asleep on the living room couch, he stomped on her face repeatedly, killing her. This time, his shoe prints were left on her face, becoming part of the crime scene evidence. And then, after Richard roamed 2 other neighborhoods, he returned to Monterey Park and chose the home of 63-year-old Sophie Dickman. There, he held Dickman at gunpoint, handcuffed her, and stole her jewelry. On July 20th, Richard bought a machete, drove to Glendale in a stolen Toyota, and broke into the Needing home. He first attacked the sleeping couple with the machete, then shot them in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. In the end, he dismembered them with the machete and robbed the house of its valuables. After hiding the valuables, Richard drove to Sun Valley, LA. He broke into Covanant's home, where he then shot a sleeping 32-year-old Chenarong in the head with a .22 caliber pistol, killing him instantly, and repeatedly raped and beat 32-year-old Somkid. In order to get their belongings, he tied up the couple's 8-year-old son and then forced Somkid to reveal the location of all the valuables in their home and asked Somkid to swear to Satan that she was not lying. On August 6th, Richard drove to Northridge and broke into the home of 30-year-old Chris Peterson and 27-year-old Virginia Peterson. He snuck into the bedroom, but the couple wasn't asleep, so Richard tried to escape. He first shot Virginia once in the face with a .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun and then shot Chris in the neck, but Chris dodged 2 shots in the struggle. In the end, the couple survived the attack, but Richard escaped as well. 2 days later, Richard broke into the home of Sakina Abawath, 27 years old, and her husband, Eos Abawath, 31 years old. He went into the house and killed Elias, who was asleep, with a .25 caliber pistol at about 2:30 a.m. He then handcuffed Sakina, made her reveal the location of valuables in the home, and raped her brutally. When the couple's 3-year-old son came into the bedroom, Richard tied him up and then continued to rape Sakina. By the time Richard escaped, she had untied her son and told him to get help from a neighbor. On August 18th, Richard left Los Angeles for San Francisco, where he broke into the homes of Peter Pan, 66 years old, and Barbara Pan, 62 years old. He shot a sleeping Peter with a .25 caliber handgun, then beat and sexually assaulted Barbara. He ultimately shot her in the head as well, ending her life. At the crime scene, Richard also wrote a pentagram and the words "Jack the Knife" on the bedroom wall in lipstick. Police identified Richard as the killer because his shoe prints had exposed him once again. At the time, lead detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo got in touch with the manufacturer of the shoe and managed to get a sample of the sole. They then found out that there were only 6 pairs of this brand and size of shoe in the United States, 5 of which were shipped to Arizona, and only 1 to a shoe store in Los Angeles. It was clear that the pair of shoes in Los Angeles belonged to the killer. But San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein accidentally revealed some key information, including shoe prints and the caliber of the gun, during a televised press conference. The detectives were pretty shocked by this because they knew the killer was probably watching the news, which would give him a chance to destroy key forensic evidence. Richard did, however, follow the news the whole time before he threw his sneakers under the Golden Gate Bridge and then went back to the Los Angeles area after spending a few days there. On August 24th, he drove a stolen orange Toyota to Mission Viejo, which is 76 miles south of Los Angeles. He then went to the home of 45-year-old James Romero Jr. to prepare for another burglary. James's son was going to take a pillow from the car late at night. As he stepped out of the house, he heard some strange noises but didn't think much of it. When he went into the garage to work on his bike and heard footsteps outside the house, he saw Richard through the window and immediately ran into the bedroom and woke up his parents. As Richard was getting ready to leave in his car, he also quickly wrote down the color, make, and part of the license plate number and waited until it was light out to give this information to the police. At first, the police just thought he had chased off a thief. Richard didn't stop his attacks that night. He switched targets, targeting the home of Bill Carnes, 30, and his fiancée, Inez Erickson, 29. When Richard sneaked into the room, he woke Carnes up with a handgun. Carnes woke up confused, but Richard didn't stop his actions. He shot Carnes 3 times in the head and then calmed down the awakened Erickson. Richard called himself the Night Stalker, and he forced Erickson to say that she loved Satan. When she was finished, Richard took a rope and tied her up. He then went through the house looking for valuables. After taking everything, he took Erickson to another room where he raped her. As he was leaving, he told Erickson to tell the police that the Night Stalker is here. When Erickson untied herself, she went to a neighbor's house to get help, and Carnes survived because the bullets didn't damage his brain. Richard's identification was a key turning point that put an end to his reign of terror in Southern California. Erickson some credit for her courage in giving investigators such a detailed description of the assailant. On top of that, a model of Richard's footprint, which was taken from James's home, gave the police some crucial information. Richard's stolen Toyota was found in Los Angeles on August 28th, despite he trying to erase all fingerprints, but police were able to locate a clear print on the rearview mirror that was identified as belonging to Richard. At the time, he was described as a 25-year-old Texas transient with a long list of criminal convictions that also included multiple arrests for traffic violations and illegal drug issues. It was a real stroke of luck that they were able to identify Richard's fingerprints. The system they used to do this had only just been installed, and it contained the fingerprints of criminals born after January 1st, 1960. That was 2 months before Richard was born. On August 29th, the police made a big move when they released the facial photos of Richard taken during his 1984 arrest for auto theft to the media. At a press conference, the police announced, "We now know who you are, and soon everyone else will, and there's no place for you to hide." On August 30th, Richard took a bus to Tucson, Arizona, planning to visit his brother. At the time, he was unaware that he had made headlines in almost every major California newspaper and television news program. Since his brother wasn't home, he headed back to Los Angeles in the early morning hours of August 31st. At the time, all the bus stops, train stations, and airports were filled with police officers who were trying to catch the killer as he tried to escape. But when Richard passed by them, they didn't recognize him. Richard then went into a convenience store, where he saw a group of older Hispanic women pointing at him and calling him a bullfighter. He left the store in a panic after seeing his face on the front page of a newspaper with a headline calling him the Night Stalker. After crossing the Santa Ana freeway, Richard tried to get into an unlocked Ford Mustang, but was pulled out of the car by an angry resident. Richard then ran across the street and tried to take the keys from the car's owner, but the owner's husband saw what was going on and hit Richard in the head with a fence post during the chase. A dozen residents then gave chase down Hubbard Street in Boyle Heights and soon had Richard under control and beat him mercilessly. At around 8 a.m., the police arrived quickly and detained Richard, who had been severely beaten. The trial of Richard began on July 22, 1988. At his first court appearance, he raised a hand with a painted pentagram and yelled, "Hail Satan!" On August 3rd, the Los Angeles Times reported that some jail employees overheard Richard planning to sneak a gun into the courtroom and then shoot the prosecutor with it. Because of this, the police put in metal detectors outside and did thorough searches of anyone who came in. The trial was put on hold on August 14th when one of the jurors, Phyllis Singletary, didn't show up in court. Later that day, she was found dead in her apartment. The jury was understandably shaken, wondering if Richard had somehow orchestrated the incident from his cell and if he could have harmed the other jurors. However, the police ultimately concluded that Richard was not responsible for Singletary's death because she had been shot by her boyfriend, who then killed himself with the same weapon at the hotel. On September 20th, 1989, Richard was found guilty on all 43 counts. 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. On November 7th, Richard was sentenced to death and chose to be executed by gas chamber in California. Then he told reporters, "It's no big deal. Death is just part of the territory. See you at Disneyland." While he was waiting to be executed, Richard is said to have met actor Sean Penn. Penn was sentenced in prison in 1988 for reckless driving and assaulting a colors extra. He said that he received a letter from Richard as a cellmate and then wrote back to tell Richard that he had no sympathy for him and wished he would die in the gas chamber. Richard was a serial killer and even had fans who wanted to write to him and visit him. Doreen Lyle started writing to Richard in 1985, sending him nearly 75 letters while he was in prison. In 1988, Richard proposed to Lyle, and they tied the knot on October 3rd, 1996, at San Quentin State Prison in California. On August 7th, 2006, Richard's first round of appeals ended in failure, and the California Supreme Court upheld his conviction and death sentence. On September 7th, the California Supreme Court denied his petition for a new trial. Richard passed away on June 7, 2013, at Marin General Hospital in Green Bay, California. He died from complications related to B-cell lymphoma, as well as chronic substance abuse and a chronic hepatitis C virus infection. When the story ended, his family didn't claim his body, so it was cremated and turned into ashes.